Xbox, the brand that once battled Sony console by console, exclusive for exclusives, the brand that millions grew up with. Halo on a Friday night, Xbox Live parties at 2 a.m. That brand is changing in ways nobody fully predicted. And today we are going to talk about whether that change is genius or a quiet goodbye. Stay with me. Welcome back to Tanveer Talks, and I'm Tanveer. Today we're going to be talking about Xbox, not just the console, not just the Game Pass, I mean the entire identity of Xbox as a business, as a brand, as a platform, as of May 2026, right? We're living through, what might be the most significant strategic pivot in gaming since Nintendo, nearly died in the early 2000s, came back with DS and the Wii. The console wars, Sony versus Microsoft, the PlayStation versus Xbox, that framing is being deliberately, dismantled by Microsoft themselves. And the crazy part is, right as the old strategy started to show cracks, the person who actually built it stepped down, and the person who replaced him is, already tearing the playbook apart. Here's what we are covering out today, right? We're going to cover hardware revenue, which is in free fall, Game Pass, which had a massive identity shakeup, Xbox first party titles, which are actually printing money on PlayStation. The studios are reshuffling. Phil Spencer actually stepped down, right? 3 months ago. And the new CEO, which was named Asha Sharma, she walked in and has already made more fan-friendly moves than, most expected in the year. So we've got a lot to unpack. So let's start with March 2026 quarterly numbers. I'm going to be direct with you. They are startling, right? Xbox hardware revenue dropped by 33%. 33%. That is not a dip. That is not a correction. That is a collapse in unit sales. It came even, after, Microsoft implemented price hikes in 2025, trying to, bolster margins on their hardware. They do sell, it didn't work. Fewer people are buying Xbox consoles, full stop. Total revenue, for the Xbox division also fell down like 6.6%, landing at 5.3 billion. Now, some analysts will say that, that was expected, given the industry's broader slowdown. Fine, right? But a 33% drop in hardware revenue is a different conversation entirely. That is a structural decline, not cyclical. Here's what makes it philosophically interesting. Even CEO Satya Nadella, has shifted the language. He's no longer talking about, winning the console generation. He's talking about foundational work, strengthening engagement, winning back fans across not just Xbox, but Windows, Bing, and, Edge. He's describing an ecosystem play, not a console play. That is a massive, rhetorical shift. And words from a CEO are rarely, accidental. I want to spend, a moment on the human side of this, If you go on Reddit right now, you will find Xbox loyalists, especially in Europe, expressing something that feels like a grief. The Xbox brand feels like it's getting smaller and smaller. The fear isn't just my console is, losing market share. The fear is if the hardware disappears, what happens to my digital library? What happens to the game I paid full price for, Are they accessible on my preferred device in 5 years? Or is it a first world problem? Absolutely. But for the hardcore fans who have been flying the Xbox flag for 2 decades, the people who owned OG Xbox, Xbox 360, Xbox One, Series X, this matters. As we'll get to, the new leadership at Xbox has actually heard this and, is responding to it, because here's the thing, you can survive a hardware decline if you keep the community. You cannot survive losing both. Now let's talk about the heart of the ecosystem, the Xbox ecosystem, Game Pass, because this is where things get really nuanced, I think a lot of, all the hot takes online are missing like the full picture. Microsoft has done 2 major things to, Game Pass recently. One, they cut the price of the Game Pass Ultimate, down from $29.99 to $22.99, right? A month. And the two, this one is, generally actually shocked people, is that they're removing Call of Duty as a day one offering on the service. Call of Duty, right? The franchise Microsoft paid $69 billion to acquire, no longer on Game Pass at launch. How does that happen? How do you spend the biggest acquisition price in the gaming history and then pull the marquee IP off your flagship subscription to the service on day one? The answer, to this is data. The Matt Piscatella from Circana, one of the most credible gaming analysts out there, made it clear. Putting Call of Duty on Game Pass day one simply did not lead to a meaningful, sustained increase in console sales or a long-term subscription retention, right? That was the thesis. The data showed it wasn't holding, Piers Harding, roles from Ampere analysis added that, important texture. Yes, there were intense short-term subscriber spikes, but when COD dropped on Game Pass, they couldn't be sustained. People subscribed for a month, played the campaign, grinded multiplayer for a few weeks, and then cancelled. The churn was real, it was eating into economics of the whole strategy. Layer on top of that, the pricing problem. At $29.99 a month, Game Pass Ultimate, was pricing itself out of reach for large segments of the audience Microsoft, was trying to attract. The new CEO, and we will get to it in like detail shortly, publicly, said in the memo that Game Pass had become too expensive for too many players. That is the CEO acknowledging, in writing that the product was priced wrong. You almost never see that kind of candor from a company this size. Here's the number I keep coming back to. Microsoft reportedly left approximately 300 million in lost premium sales on the table by putting Call of Duty on Game Pass day one. $300 million, in 1 year from one franchise. When you see a number like that, the strategy change, makes immediate sense. It was not, ideology or fan backlash that drove this. It was the math. Going forward, Call of Duty titles will join Game Pass roughly a year after the launch, the following holiday season. Current titles stay in the library, but the day one pipeline is closed for now. The older Call of Duty games from the back catalog are actually being added to Game Pass in 2026 as part of the deal. So it is not like a total loss for subscribers, but the flagship at launch is gone. That matters for the perception of the service's value. Day one releases for other titles are not dead. Microsoft is just being more selective and data driven about which games go day one and which use a windowing strategy. This is not a retreat. That is maturity. The real test is whether subscribers feel the distinction or, whether it erodes the perceived value over time. That is the tightrope. This leads us to the most controversial part of the Xbox strategy. First party games on PlayStation. The numbers here are generally wild. Forza Horizon 5, sold over 5 million copies on PlayStation 5, generating over $300 million in revenue. Not players through a subscription, not time played metrics, cash transactions. People taking out their wallets and buying an Xbox franchise game on a Sony console. These are figures, that are eclipsing some of the PlayStation's own first party releases. This is seismic. Under Phil Spencer, this was the entire thesis. He said, there were, quote, no red lines on which Xbox games could eventually, make the jump to other platforms. Halo campaign evolved, Fable, and Forza Horizon 6 were all on 2026 PlayStation roadmap. That wall between Xbox and PlayStation for software was essentially gone. But, here is where it gets complicated. Where the new leadership is starting to, pump the brakes. There was a narrative, building in the community somewhat, tongue-in-cheek, that Xbox Game Pass subscribers were essentially glorified beta testers, that they get the game first via subscriptions, often, before all the patches land, while PlayStation, players wait a few months, get the more polished version at a lower permanent price on a platform they prefer. And it's not just Forza, right? Avowed Obsidian's, RPG, heading to your PlayStation with a permanent price drop attached, and the pattern, was becoming obvious enough that, even people who supported the multi-platform strategy were starting to ask, what is the actual incentive to own an Xbox, right? And the new CEO, Asha Sharma, has heard this loud and clear. She has said publicly she is re-evaluating the exclusivity approach. It's describing it as, a decisions with decade-long impact that she wants to get right rather than get fast. The games already announced for PlayStation 2026 are still on track. But what comes after them is now generally an open question. And according to insiders, internal discussions about exclusivity at, Xbox right now are, I'm quoting a report from Windows Central, massive. If you are Microsoft and you're looking at data in isolation, the multi-platform revenue case is strong. 5 million copies of Forza on PS5 is hard to argue with. But if you have to zoom out and ask what it does to the identity and health of the Xbox platform long term, that is a much more complicated answer. And Sharma seems to be asking that harder question. And behind the scenes, studios inside the Xbox umbrella are feeling the pressure of this result-oriented new era. Let's look at, Ninja Theory, because it is a perfect study and case study in how the internal culture is shifting. Project Mara, the experimental horror Project Ninja Theory was, developing a standalone experience, has probably been shelved. That is a generally disappointing for anyone following it, Ninja Theory are one of the most, creatively ambitious studios in Xbox, stable. But the directive seems to be clear, focus your resources on proven franchises that can deliver, commercially. So Ninja Theory has moved all internal resources to Hellblade 3, and the feedback from Hellblade 2, which was, visually extraordinary, but took criticism for a relatively light combat, is being taken actually seriously. The sequel is being built built with gameplay front and center. The goal is to create a title that can, stand on its own in whatever platform, world, Xbox ends up in, without leaving an exclusivity as a crutch, Then there's this decryptive stuff, which I love. Xbox social team recently replied to a Reddit post, hinting it's going to be a good year for titles ending in the number 6. They just dropped it, no context, let the internet lose its mind, which actually it did. And the community immediately started, parsing this. And at Elder Scrolls 6, the most anticipated game in gaming history at this point, a game that has become a meme because of how long it has been sitting in, pre-production, immediately came up, But most analysts believe the reference, was almost certainly aimed at Grand Theft Auto 6, which is one of the biggest entertainment releases of the decade. Will generate enormous revenue for Xbox through Game Pass and, PC storefronts, regardless of who made it. Post Activision, Microsoft now controls 13 franchises. They're worth over $1 billion each. Halo, Forza, Minecraft, Call of Duty, Diablo, Overwatch, Elder Scrolls, Fallout. The roster is deep. And whoever is running Xbox, the message is clear. These franchises will go wherever makes the most strategic sense. The question of where that is, exclusive or multiplat, is exactly what Sharma is, the currently figuring out. Okay, we cannot, talk about, where Xbox is going without talking about the leadership change, right? Because everything we have covered so far, the hardware decline, the Game Pass reset, the multi-platform debate, all of it is, now being, filtered through a completely new decision maker. On Feb 20th, 2026, Phil Spencer announced that he was retiring from Microsoft, after 38 years at the company, 12 years leading Xbox. Sarah Bond, the Xbox president, also exited. The person taking over was Asha Sharma, formerly the president of Microsoft's the core AI division, not a gaming industry veteran, an AI executive. And the community's first reaction was skepticism. An AI person running Xbox at a moment, when the industry is already anxious about AI's role in game development, it felt a lot of people, like Microsoft was signaling that X was about to become an AI testing ground rather than a platform built around great games. They were wrong, obviously. And Sharma has spent her first 3 months proving it, through actions rather than press releases. First thing she did, she killed "This is an Xbox" marketing campaign. Completely axed it. If you go to the Xbox Wire right now, the campaign post is gone from the website. Microsoft actually had a spokesperson publicly confirm it with a statement that read, and I love this, Asha retired this as "This is an Xbox" because it didn't feel like Xbox. He's personally leading a reset of how we show up as a brand, A company publicly admitting its own campaign was a mistake. You almost never see that, if you need a reminder of what the campaign was, it claimed that, anything running Game Pass was an Xbox, your smart TV, your phone, your PlayStation, theoretically, it was trying to make the hardware irrelevant. Position Xbox as a pure software ecosystem. Hardcore fans hated it. It felt like Microsoft was preparing you for, the box to disappear entirely. And Sharma understood that and killed it on arrival. And she also announced, Project Helix, the next gen Xbox console. This is the first party Microsoft console powered by a custom AMD chip using RDNA 5 architecture on the TSMC's 3nm process. It's designed to run both Xbox console games and PC games natively. A true console and a PC hybrid, Developer alpha kits are planned to ship in 2027, pointing to a probable, consumer launch in late 2027. And Microsoft has confirmed it will be sold as a first-party device, not licensed out to, third parties. Beyond hardware, Sharma assembled a team, specifically dedicated to listening and acting on player feedback. She overhauled the achievement system. She brought back Xbox Fan Fest. She announced a Discord partnership. Within 3 months, the community went from grief to something, that looked like cautious optimism. You started seeing posts on social media with just a checklist of everything she had done. Slashed Game Pass price, killed a bad campaign, prioritized console, review exclusives, announced Project Helix, bring back FanFest, check, But, and this is important, goodwill runs out. The checklist is real. The community energy is positive. None of that matters long term, if Project Helix does not land. If the exclusivity question stays unresolved or, Game Pass continues to shed the premium value that made it special, Sharma has, bought herself time. She has not brought herself unlimited time, but she has publicly said herself that a player and revenue growth has not yet met her, ambition. That is a CEO setting expectations honestly in her first quarter that, actually matters. Okay, as we wrap up, we have to address the sword, that has been hanging over all of this. Because the stakes could not be higher, and the clock is ticking. Back in 2023, during the FTC hearing on the Activision acquisition, a leaked document revealed, something from Phil Spencer that has never, fully left the conversation. He said, quoting directly, "If we do not make more progress than this off of a console, we will exit the gaming business." He was talking about the need for, meaningful growth in PC and cloud gaming by fiscal year 2027. We are in fiscal 2026. That window is right now. Spencer walked back that statement, of extremity, in public. Basically, he's like, there are legitimate reason to believe Microsoft, is not about to fall in gaming. You do not spend $69 billion on Activision and exit 2 years later. The spirit of that document is alive in everything happening right now. The 33% hardware revenue drop would be a death knell in any other narrative. What is cushioning it is the massive multi-plat, software revenue. The Forza numbers, the Evolve trajectory, the Xbox games generating hundreds of millions on PlayStation. That is the progress of a console, Spencer was basically pointing to, the question is whether the Sharma can maintain the software revenue momentum, which while, also rebuilding the console identity that sponsor eroded, because those two goals are in tension. More exclusive means less PlayStation revenue, more PlayStation ports mean more money, but a weaker reason to own the box. Project Helix is, is a bet, that resolves that tension. A console, a PC hybrid, that gives players the most flexible, powerful gaming device ever made by Microsoft. One that can run your Xbox library, your Steam library, and your Game Pass library all in one place is the product that could potentially justify the console's existence without relying on exclusives alone. It is a genuinely different value proposition from anything Xbox has tried before. Spencer once said, Xbox was not just a box anymore. It's an app on your TV, your phone, your PC. Sharma seems to be saying, actually, the box still matters. It just needs to be a better box, Project Helix is that answer, and whether it is the right answer depends entirely on the execution. So, is Xbox dead? Or is it more alive than ever? If you define Xbox by how many people are playing their games, they are reaching heights they never hit with 360. Now, if you define it by the single box under your TV and a clear identity around it, that is still being, rebuilt in real time. Phil Spencer built an empire. Asha Sharma is inheriting it in the middle of the pivot, trying to course correct without losing revenue gains, while also winning back the fans who felt left behind. It is generally one of the most interesting leadership challenges in the industry right now, right? And I'll be watching, this Project Helix announcements and whatever comes of it closely, and I'll be talking about it here. Thanks for tuning into Tanveer Talks. If you're on YouTube, like and subscribe. It helps more than you know. And if you're on Spotify, follow the show, leave a rating, and let me know down in the comments. Are you buying the Asha Sharma's comeback story, or are you in wait and see mode? Drop it down below. I read every single comment. So this is Tanveer Talks. See you in the next episode. Peace.